Dear fellow Thicketeers, thank you for joining me in this talk where I want to share a possible way of looking at Thicket, a framework as you will, that we could use to improve our understanding of how Thicket operates. I'm Alastair Potts, an ecologist who's been trying to get to grips with this ancient and globally unique vegetation we call Thicket. I need to point out that in this talk I'm referring only to speckboom Thicket. Jan Vlok opened this year's forum with a fantastic overview of the different thicket types and their drivers. But I'm sure you noticed that the term speckboom thicket was not explicitly used in his slides. However, Jan does use this to describe speckboom dominated thicket in his extensive work, and it almost exclusively occurs within the valley and arid thicket types, where Portulacaria afra makes up the largest proportion of the canopy biomass, usually. An interesting thing to remember when thinking about speckboom thicket is that it is one of the few vegetation types across the world that can be thought of as dominated with a high biomass of cam photosynthesis. If you're not familiar with what that term means, Guy Midgley will be giving us a talk later in the forum where he will unpack for us cam photosynthesis in South Africa. In Anthony's presentation, he shared with us the opportunity that the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration offers thicket. And he too was exclusively referring to the speckboom dominated thicket types. So just remember that subtropical thicket extends to other plant communities, and this can be a source of confusion if you're not keeping track of which thicket type is under discussion. So just to reiterate, this talk is about the semi-arid speckboom dominated forms in the arid and valley thicket types. Before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to say that much of my thinking has been shaped by a wide range of people over the years, and I'd like to highlight that and thank them for interesting discussions and disagreements that has kept me delving deeper into this fascinating topic of trying to understand how thicket works. Before I get into the heart of my talk, I'd like us to consider two questions that we'll return to at the end. The first being that if we were to look anywhere in Africa for the oldest trees and the oldest plant communities, those trees that have been sitting and growing and standing next to each other, where would we look? And I argue that we should first look in the subtropical thicket. I would also argue that the intact thicket has largely been seen as valueless in a free market economy. Thus, how can we conserve this ecosystem while still enabling people to generate livelihoods across the thicket landscape? The way I'd like us to think about thicket, at least for this presentation, is through the lens of disturbance. I'd like to define disturbance as anything that reduces plant biomass and diversity. Just to be clear, not all disturbance is bad, and in fact in many systems like fynbos and grasslands, fire acting as a disturbance agent is a crucial part of maintaining those ecosystems. To kick off, I'd like us to think about why thicket occurs where it does in South Africa. Jan Vlok pointed out that it occurs in a region where rainfall is spread fairly evenly across both winter and summer. But why doesn't thicket expand beyond this zone? Well, there's grassland and savannas to the east and fynbos to the west. And these are fire-driven biomes. And thicket, especially the succulent thicket, dominated by species such as speckboom, is very, very fire intolerant. And so although thicket may occur in the burning biome landscapes, they occur in small pockets of the landscape that are fire refugia. But why don't we get fires in this northwest region? What's going on here? This is a figure showing the elevation in South Africa. The areas in brown are unusually high, and this is where our Namakru shrubland and grasslands are found. It's also these areas that experience a substantial amount of frost, and these colder temperatures largely keep out trees, and thus thicket in this interior plateau region is kept out by the presence of frost. So we can think of thicket as being trapped between fire and frost. To the west and to the east, there are seasonal dry periods which allow the vegetation to dry out and fires to burn, and in the interior plateau, those lower temperatures in winter that cause frost to keep thicket out. But let's have a closer look into this thicket region and see what's going on at the landscape level. This is a Google Earth image of the Seerberg mountain range. This dark green vegetation is thicket, whereas this light yellow vegetation is grassland. Fires occur up in this grassland, but not in thicket. Why do we have these two biomes right next to each other then? The reason is that there's a geological transition, with the Cape Fold Belt sandstones on the upper slopes and crest of the hills, whereas shale occurs on the lower slopes in the valley bottom. This overall region does not get much rainfall, and grasses struggle to grow on the combination of low rainfall and shale. So that means that grasses cannot burn into the thicket and invade. However, thicket also struggles to invade onto this upland sandstone areas where there are fires. The only places they can invade are where there are topographic refugia, where the fire struggles to burn. Thus, a general rule of thumb is that thicket occurs on shales where there's low rainfall, and the burning biomes struggle to get a foothold. So when it comes to where subtropical thicket is found, fire and frost play an important role both at a regional and local scale. What other disturbances are there? Well, let's look at wind, which plays an important role in tall forests as it can cause trees to topple and create gaps in the forest canopy. Well, thicket is a very short vegetation, so wind is not going to cause any major damage to these plants. Another interesting thing about thicket is that it's useful to point out that it packs a lot of species into a small space. For example, let's have a look into this canopy and see what species we can find. Just in this photo alone, there are 8 different plant species, a mixture of trees and creepers, and this suggests that the competition, at least for light, isn't very intense. And so, what about what's going on under the canopy? Here's a picture taken under Valley Thicket at Jack's picnic site in Addo Elephant National Park. There's no disturbance, but the canopy lets in enough light to host a whole range of succulent species. I don't know how common this really is, and in Jan's talk he gives an example of where a lack of disturbance may be causing species to be outcompeted in the system and to be lost. However, that's not what's going on here. So we really need to understand the understory light dynamics across the whole thicket spectrum far better than we currently do. So wind doesn't play a role in the disturbance of thicket. However, another climatic factor that may likely be very important is that of drought. The arid and valley thicket types occur in an aseasonal and low rainfall regime area, where droughts are incredibly common. Something that I think we take for granted, but is actually very odd, is that in an area with low rainfall and drought is common, almost all the plant species are evergreen. That's actually quite astounding. There is this idea that most of the plant species are drought deciduous, meaning that they lose their leaves during drought and regrow them when the rains return. However, Daniel Butner and Rob Skelton have been exploring the drought resilience of thicket tree species, and they'll question this assumption and share their actually quite astounding results in a later talk in this forum. So how does this system have so much plant life and sheer biomass if it is so dry? Well, that's where speckball, Portulacaria afra, comes in. It contributes a range of services to the ecosystem and plays a key role in certain types of thicket and parts of the landscape. Part of this key role is its growth form, where it can grow a skirt and be a shrub, or even grow tall enough to be classified as a tree. The first service that speckball offers is that of producing copious amounts of leaf litter that end up changing the soil and water properties. This is a photo of the ground underneath the speckball clump. You can see the leaf litter, and when you dig into it, you find a rich layer of mulch, which even hosts its own biodiversity. I found snails and frogs active in this leaf litter while it's a baking hot day above the canopy. There are also a number of studies, such as this one, that have demonstrated that the landscape becomes essentially dysfunctional when speckball is removed and this leaf litter is lost. The next service is that of increasing the time that water spends in this landscape after rainfall. You've likely seen this figure before. It's quite famous in thicket circles, but it's a fundamental one, so I'm going to show it to you again. Soil moisture probes in the study were used to monitor what was happening in the soil under degraded and intact thicket. The y-axis is soil depth, so they monitored to a depth of 60 centimeters. The x-axis is time, so they captured at least 10 rainfall events over 7 months. And each cell in the figure represents the moisture at the particular depth at that given point in time. The upper panel is of a soil moisture probe placed in degraded thicket, whereas the lower panel is of a probe placed nearby on the other side of a fence into intact thicket. So the two probes were close by spatially, but miles apart in terms of the vegetation they were under. The cooler colors in the lower panel show that the water is present at greater depths for longer, and this demonstrates how speckworm is responsible for both increasing infiltration and reducing evaporation. So both this leaf litter and water retention changes the microenvironment, making it wetter and cooler in this hot, arid region. And this supports the establishment of seedlings of other thicket species. Research by Ayanda Seguela for his PhD clearly demonstrated the importance of speckworm for the establishment of other thicket species. He conducted extensive surveys in both open areas and under the speckworm canopy looking for seedlings. For almost all species, he found a significantly higher number under the canopy than in the open, and this demonstrates just how important that canopy microsite is for facilitating the establishment of seedlings of other thicket plant species and buffering them against the effects of drought. There is another service that speckworm might be offering its neighboring plants to survive drought, although at this stage it remains very speculative, and that is providing water to neighboring plants. Work by Kathleen Smart demonstrates that speckworm can rapidly increase its stem diameter after a rainfall event, effectively acting as a sponge, and this has potential ramifications for neighboring plants. The speckworm sponge may also be releasing water back into the soil. A study conducted on an entirely different continent, looking at a different system, looking at saguaro cactuses, found that neighboring shrubs were receiving water from the columnar cacti. It's possible that a similar mechanism is at play in speckworm and its neighboring trees, although this still needs to be investigated. Speckworm is a dominant component of most of the succulent thicket, and so I would argue is a landscape facilitator enabling the formation of this incredible dense dwarf forest in a semi-arid landscape, buffering it against drought. So when we're talking about speckworm, we can use terms like nurse plant, facilitator, and even ecosystem engineers to describe the role that this species is playing in thicket types where it is dominant. Okay, we're done with drought as a driver of disturbance and the buffering that speckworm likely is offering the vegetation as a whole. Let's move on to our next disturbance factor, that of herbivores, specifically mesoherbivores that are social mixed feeders, meaning that they occur in large groups and can eat a wide range of plants. The effect that mesoherbivores can have on thicket has been discussed by earlier speakers. Ultimately, overbrowsing can be devastating for thicket. Unsustainable usage of thicket transforms it into a low productivity degraded state. However, there's good evidence that we can reverse this using speckworm restoration, as Anthony Mills shared in his talk. This is a thicket-wide plot that was planted over a decade ago and shows promises for restoring the slope. Thus, domestic mesoherbivores are well documented to have a negative effect on both speckworm and thicket. But what about mesoherbivores that are indigenous to southern Africa? Surely they wouldn't have the same effect? Well, to consider the potential role that indigenous herbivores could be having on thicket, there are two additional components we need to consider. Firstly, predators and how they may have influenced the density of sociable mixed feeders in thicket, and the availability of water across the landscape, what I like to call the waterscape. Let's first explore the role of predators. This is an aerial view of intact thicket. It's quite simply very, very dense. And it's still pretty dense on the ground, and it's not really easy to see far. I never really thought much of this until I was fortunate enough to do some thicket research on Kwandwe Private Nature Reserve, where they do have lions. And all of a sudden this vegetation became quite nerve-wracking to walk through and work through. I was never knowing if there was a lion just around the next bush. And this fear is well founded. Andrew Davies and colleagues studied where lions living in thicket were hunting and killing most of their prey. And I suppose it's predictable, but wherever herbivores couldn't see, they were far more likely to be killed by lions. So lions were hunting, using this for ambush hunting. Thus, predators have a negative effect on gregarious herbivores, increasing the fearscape of thicket, and thus making it unlikely that these herbivores will live in intact thicket. This then reduces the effects of herbivory and the disturbance that these mesoherbivores could be having on both speckworm and thicket. Another crucial factor that determines the herbivore population in semi-arid thicket landscapes is the availability of water. And I think beyond the biosphere effect, which is the effect just around the water points, I think the role of water availability across the greater landscape has not been explored or understood in thicket. Let's have a look at this regional scale. This is a map of the perennial water sources, exaggerated so that we can see them. Note that even in extreme droughts, the major rivers like the Gamtus have been recorded to dry up. When we include in red all the artificial water points that have been mapped, again exaggerated so that we can see them clearly, you can readily see that water availability has been homogenized across the landscape. This has some very important ramifications. Firstly, there's this loss of something I call the thirst refugia, areas that are distant from water, and this could result in the decline of thicket plant species that are intolerant to browsing. This loss of the thirst refugia would also result in the thinning out of thicket by either domestic or indigenous herbivores, simply because there are more herbivores on this landscape than would ever have been experienced during prehistory or through evolutionary time in these semi-arid regions. The only paper I've managed to find on this topic is a recent study from Australia where they calculated the distance in different parts of the semi-arid landscapes to perennial water. On the left, all the areas in red were further than 25 kilometers from water, and this is during prehistory. And whereas one can readily see the increase of black and grey under present-day condition, indicating that large parts of this landscapes are now less than 5 kilometers from water. The impact of constant herbivore populations on the diversity and long-term functioning of semi-arid ecosystem requires way more attention, especially globally, and when it comes to thicket. Thus, increasing the water availability by people increases the disturbance of sociable mixed feeding mesoherbivores on both speckworm and thicket. Whereas this was not the case in prehistory, where herbivore densities would have been orders of magnitude lower than what we find today. Thus, the combination of predators and a lack of water kept the herbivores out of thicket. The current biomass of herbivores in thicket landscapes, I want to really reiterate this, is likely to be evolutionarily unprecedented. But what about the mega herbivores, often called keystone species in thicket? Well, elephants increase the impact of large predators on herbivores. In areas without elephants, the canopy is closed and there are no pathways or channels in the thicket. If there are no elephant pathways for the game to walk down, ambush hunting becomes very difficult. Thus, where there are elephants, predators can make use of these pathways for hunting. So mega herbivores can have a positive effect on predators. What about positive effects on the plants? Well, let's take one example of how elephants may be beneficial for speckworm. Elephants waste a lot of material. They break off a branch and can munch on it for many meters, a bit like a lollipop, before discarding it. This means that there are a lot of broken branches that fall on the ground that have been dispersed by elephants. So just like this branch has been transported at least 30 meters from the closest speckworm. And speckworm has this remarkable ability to resprout from those broken branches. It's this trait that allows us to use it for restoration, the restoration work that Anthony Mills was describing. Laura Wattam in her honours project surveyed over 300 broken speckworm branches from elephant feeding and found that 20% of them had naturally rooted and were on their way to making new individuals. So mega herbivores can have a positive effect on speckworm, and are certainly not just limited to this plant species, as they assist many of the other plant species in various ways, especially when it comes to seed dispersal. However, are there negative effects of mega herbivores in the system? Elephants are often referred to as keystone species in thicket, which suggests that if they were removed, then the thicket ecosystem would fall apart, and if there are too many of them, that there wouldn't be an issue. In savannas, elephants are highly destructive to the tree canopy. They push over trees, they strip off the bark. However, this is largely not the case. Things like bark stripping and pushing over the trees is generally far lower in thicket. And this is mostly driven by the very different morphology of the thicket trees and shrubs in comparison to the pole architecture usually found in savannas. Take this Euclea undulata, for example, which is not growing a single tall stem, but rather it's got multiple stem emerging from this underground burrow. Thus, even if a branch is lost to elephant browsing, the plant can readily resprout. Many of the thicket plants have similar morphology, making it very difficult for elephants to kill individuals. Thus, under prehistoric circumstances, it's likely that elephants had a very low impact on thicket. However, with the increased availability of water in these landscapes, the situation has changed dramatically. This is Hapua Dam in Addo Elephant National Park, and when seen from the air like this, it kind of looks like the site of a bomb blast. This water point could very well be in the running for supplying water to the greatest biomass of indigenous herbivores anywhere in the world on a daily basis. And the surrounding vegetation shows the effects of this continuous presence in high density. Despite the adaptations that many of the plants have for dealing with elephant herbivory, this phenomenon is well studied and demonstrates that the availability of water has massive repercussions for the state of thicket. Thus, increasing the availability of water, coupled with restricted movement of mega herbivores within fenced reserves, has changed the balance of mega herbivore impact from overall positive to what I would argue to be very definitely negative. In prehistory, and without human-made water points, mega herbivore densities would have been a small fraction of those found today. William Bond suggested three very different views of the plant world. That is, it's controlled by resources, such as the amount of rainfall and nutrients in the soil. He called this the green world. Those that are controlled by fire, such as fynbos, he termed this the black plant world, whereas the brown world was controlled by herbivores. The two consumer views result in a reduction in the plant biomass below what is expected that can be supported by the climate. I would argue that thicket may not fit any of these views expressed here, as the ecosystem engineering and facilitation that is done by speckworm may actually increase the biomass far beyond what is expected by the climate. I think we may have been misled into thinking that thicket was a brown world biome and that browsers drove the system. But I suspect that because of predators and the lack of water, they've played a very minor role in this system. So returning to the questions that I asked at the start of the talk, the first being, are these communities the oldest in Africa? We need to ask ourselves, what would cause these plants to die? Under natural prehistory conditions, the disturbance from climate, fire, and herbivores would have been exceptionally minor, and thus once a plant or a population was established, there was very little that could cause its demise. And so to answer the question, without further gilding the lily and no more ado, the answer is quite simple and straightforward. I don't know. But I do hope that this talk, looking at how thicket may have operated under natural conditions, has also made you wonder whether this vegetation should be treasured as a plant museum. How old could these plants really be? Well, I strongly suspect that these trees easily exceed more than 1,000 years in arid thickets. We're going to be working on this, and hopefully we can have some results for you soon. My other question was how best to conserve this intact thicket if we have landscapes that have lots of water and herbivores. And in my opinion, one of the best ways to do this is to create botanical reserves that keep out the herbivores. This can be done in areas that have both domestic or indigenous herbivores. It could even be done in a matrix with citrus, and citrus might be able to sell their oranges as biodiversity friendly. Maintaining thicket and the biodiversity in botanical reserves is cheap and largely hassle-free. It just has to be left alone. Thus, in areas that need to be cleared for economic activities, establishing botanical reserves in various configurations that are included in the title deeds and closely monitored could be one of the crucial tools that can be used for maintaining thicket over long time spans. And I'm talking particularly here of intact thicket. The size and edge effects of botanical reserves still needs to be investigated, but field observations suggest that it's very possible at a range of sizes and configurations. The suggestion to establish botanical reserves to conserve thicket is quite old, already suggested more than 2 decades ago for Addo. Here I suggest that it's expanded as a standard operating procedure across thicket landscapes, as they require minimal management, can be used as marketing tools, help maintain populations and species, but does need a landscape level plan to make best use of this opportunity. That finally brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this framework of thinking about semi-arid forms of thicket will stimulate new conversations and ideas on how the nuts and bolts of thicket fit together to form this absolutely amazing ecosystem.